Being ungovernable is not what you think it is, and the psychology behind it is one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of behavioral science. Most people hear ungovernable and think of rebellion, chaos, or refusing to follow rules. But what if the research shows that the people who are genuinely ungovernable, who cannot be manipulated, cannot be controlled by fear or approval, cannot be herded by social pressure, are not the loudest people in the room, but the most internally anchored? What if being ungovernable is not about defiance at all, but about a specific psychological structure that makes external control simply slide off? And what if most people have been trained from childhood to be exactly the opposite? The science of what makes a person truly ungovernable starts with something almost no one talks about. And by the end of this conversation, you will never look at your own compliance the same way again. By the end of this video, you will understand the documented psychology of autonomous selfhood, what it actually means to be ungovernable in the deepest sense, why the human social system is designed to make you governable, what the research has found about the specific people who resist that programming, and exactly how to develop the psychological architecture that makes external control over your thoughts, emotions, and choices progressively less available to anyone who tries to exercise it. This is grounded entirely in real science, and it starts now. Before anything else, we need to be precise about what ungovernable means. Because the casual version of the word and the psychologically significant version of the word are quite different. And confusing them produces not freedom, but a different kind of captivity. The casual version of ungovernable is reactive. It is defined by what it opposes. The ungovernable person, in this version, is the one who refuses rules, challenges authority for the sake of challenging it, resists social norms as a demonstration of independence. This version of ungovernable is still organized around external reference. The rebel who defines themselves by opposition to the system is as controlled by the system as the conformist, just running the program in reverse. The external authority is still determining the direction. The rebel simply chooses the opposite direction every time. The psychologically significant version of ungovernable is something fundamentally different. It is not reactive. It is internally generated. It is the state in which external pressure, social approval, group conformity, institutional authority, manipulative influence, fear-based compliance simply has less purchase. Not because the person is indifferent to others or above social consequence, but because they have developed a sufficiently strong internal reference system that they no longer require external validation to know what they think, what they value, and what they will do. This distinction between reactive opposition and genuine psychological autonomy is one of the most important in all of motivational psychology. And it maps directly onto a framework that has been one of the most rigorously tested in the field, self-determination theory, developed by Deci and Richard Ryan at the University of Rochester. Deci and Ryan's research, spanning more than 4 decades and thousands of studies, established that human beings have 3 fundamental psychological needs: the need for competence, the need for relatedness, and most relevant here, the need for autonomy. Autonomy, in their framework, is not independence from others. It is the experience of acting from one's own values and genuine interests rather than from external pressure or internal compulsion. It is the experience of being the author of your own behavior rather than its subject. Research on autonomy satisfaction across dozens of countries and cultures found that the degree to which people experience genuine autonomy, the sense that their actions and choices genuinely arise from their own values and interests, is one of the strongest predictors of well-being, vitality, psychological health, and what the research calls authentic living. And the deficit of autonomy, the state in which behavior is driven by external pressure, fear of disapproval, shame, or the compulsive need for external validation, is associated with measurably worse outcomes across every domain studied. The ungovernable person, in the psychologically precise sense, is the autonomy-satisfied person. The person whose internal reference system is sufficiently developed and sufficiently trusted that external governability decreases not through willful opposition, but through the natural consequence of having somewhere else to stand. But understanding what being ungovernable means is only the beginning. To understand why it is difficult in Sambai, and why most people are significantly more governable than they realize, you need to understand the system that is actively working to make them that way. This is the part of the conversation that most people find uncomfortable, because it requires an honest examination of the social and developmental forces that shaped your relationship with external authority. And the picture that emerges is not flattering to the systems involved. Human beings are born with a nervous system that is calibrated for social dependency. This is not a malfunction, it is a design specification. The human infant is among the most helpless offspring in the animal kingdom, requiring years of sustained care and protection before achieving any degree of functional independence. This biological reality produced an evolutionary imperative for social attachment and social compliance that is, in its developmental form, genuinely adaptive. The child who learns to read social cues, respond to the approval and disapproval of caregivers, and modulate behavior in ways that maintain attachment is a child who is more likely to survive and develop successfully. Research by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth on attachment theory established that the infant's most fundamental drive, more fundamental even than hunger, in some conditions, is proximity to the attachment figure. The terror of abandonment, the relief of reunion, the behavioral inhibition in the presence of caregiver disapproval. These are the foundational experiences through which the nervous system learns that social approval is not merely pleasant, but existentially significant. And the learning is this: external approval equals safety. External disapproval equals threat. This learning is appropriate for a dependent infant. The problem is that most people carry it, essentially unrevised, into adulthood. The adult whose nervous system still operates on the infant's equation, approval equals safety, disapproval equals threat, is an adult who is structurally susceptible to external governability, who will modify their stated opinions to avoid social disapproval, who will conform to group norms that contradict their own values rather than face the discomfort of non-belonging, who will comply with authority that they privately believe is wrong rather than bear the cost of visible opposition. Research by Solomon Asch at Swarthmore College in the 1950s documented this susceptibility with a precision that has never been seriously challenged. Asch's conformity experiments presented subjects with simple perceptual tasks, matching the length of a line to one of 3 comparison lines, in which the correct answer was unambiguous. When research confederates gave clearly incorrect answers, approximately 75% of subjects went along with the incorrect group consensus at least once, and roughly 1/3 of subjects conformed to the incorrect answer the majority of the time. The most striking finding was not the conformity itself, but its mechanism. Post-experiment interviews revealed that subjects who conformed were not simply giving answers they didn't believe to avoid conflict. Many of them had genuinely come to doubt their own correct perception. The social pressure was not merely changing behavior, it was changing the experience of reality. If social pressure can change what people see, in conditions where the correct answer is objectively and obviously clear, consider what it does to the far more complex and ambiguous domains of opinion, value, belief, and identity. Consider how much of what you currently believe, what you currently value, what you would currently say in a social context, reflects your genuine internal state. And how much reflects the learned behavioral adaptation to an environment where approval equals safety. This is the governability system, and it is not primarily a system of external coercion. It is a system of internalized compliance, one that operates not by forcing you to conform, but by making non-conformity feel genuinely threatening at the neurological level. Understanding this, genuinely understanding it with its full implications, is the first step toward the specific psychological development that produces genuine ungovernability. But before we can talk about how to develop it, we need to understand what specific capacities are required. The research on autonomy, identity, and authentic self-determination has converged on 3 specific psychological capacities that together constitute what I am calling genuine ungovernability. They are not traits you either have or don't have. They are capacities that can be developed, and that the research has documented with enough specificity to describe how development actually proceeds. The first is values clarity. Not the values you would report if asked in a social context, not the values that are endorsed by your community, your professional identity, or the version of yourself you present to others. The values you actually hold, as evidenced by what you actually care about when you are genuinely honest with yourself. The things that, when they are violated, produce a specific quality of internal distress that is different from social embarrassment or fear of disapproval. The things you would choose in a context where the social cost of choosing them was removed. Research on values and authentic living by Brian Little at the University of Cambridge found that the degree to which a person's daily activities are organized around their genuinely held values, as opposed to socially endorsed values, instrumental goals, or behavior driven by external pressure, is one of the strongest predictors of what Little calls personal project efficacy, and more broadly of psychological well-being and life satisfaction. The person who has clear, genuinely owned values has an internal reference system that is active and accessible. The person whose values are primarily inherited, adopted from social context, or held as abstract endorsements without genuine internal ownership has no stable ground to stand on when external pressure pushes. Values clarity is not a personality trait. It is the product of deliberate self-examination. The specific cognitive work of asking again and again, in different contexts and at different moments, what do I actually think about this? Not what am I supposed to think, or what would be safe to think, or what does my group think? What do I actually think when I examine the evidence and my own genuine response to it, as honestly as I can. The second pillar is distress tolerance, the capacity to experience social disapproval, conflict, rejection, or isolation without those experiences being existentially overwhelming. This capacity is the direct antidote to the governability system's primary mechanism, the equation of disapproval with threat. To the degree that you can tolerate disapproval, can experience it as uncomfortable and costly without experiencing it as dangerous, the social compliance pressure loses its primary source of leverage. Research by Marsha Linehan at the University of Washington on distress tolerance, developed in the context of dialectical behavior therapy, established that the capacity to tolerate painful emotional experiences without avoidance, suppression, or impulsive action is both trainable and consequential. People with higher distress tolerance are more capable of acting in accordance with their values. When doing so produces social friction, they can maintain their position in the face of group pressure without being destabilized. They can bear the discomfort of being the dissenting voice without being driven by the discomfort into capitulation. The third pillar is identity stability, what psychologists call a stable, coherent, well-differentiated sense of self that does not require external validation to maintain its integrity. Research by Jonathan Cheek at Wellesley College and Michael Kernis at the University of Georgia on self-concept clarity, the degree to which a person's self-understanding is clear, consistent, and confidently held, found that people with high self-concept clarity show significantly lower susceptibility to social influence, greater stability of behavior across contexts, and greater resistance to manipulation. They are, in the precise sense we are using, more ungovernable. These three pillars, values clarity, distress tolerance, and identity stability, are the architecture of genuine psychological ungovernability, and each of them can be developed. But the development requires understanding the specific mechanisms through which most people have been trained away from them, which means examining the social and developmental pressures that work against their formation. The human developmental environment from childhood through adolescence and into adult professional life, is in most cases a sustained training program in governability. This is not a conspiracy. It is the emergent property of social systems that require coordination, that are organized around hierarchies of authority, and that depend on sufficient levels of compliance to function. But the effect on individual psychological development is specific, documented, and worth examining honestly. Research by Alfie Kohn, drawing on decades of educational psychology, established that the dominant pedagogical model in most educational systems is organized around extrinsic motivation, the use of external rewards and punishments, grades and gold stars, and the approval of teachers to produce the desired behavior. Kohn's synthesis of the research found that extrinsic motivation systematically undermines intrinsic motivation over time. The child who was initially curious about learning for its own sake develops a progressively more instrumentalized relationship with intellectual engagement, doing the task for the external reward rather than the intrinsic interest. And with that shift comes the progressive development of an externally oriented relationship with one's own performance, opinions, and identity. What school is teaching, alongside the curriculum, is that the appropriate measure of whether you are doing well is external, the grade, the teacher's approval, the ranking, the evaluative gaze of the authority figure who holds the power to reward or punish. And this teaching is powerful because it is embedded in hundreds of hours of experience per year, across the most formative developmental years of life. The workplace continues the same training. Research by Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School on psychological safety in organizational settings found that the majority of workplaces are characterized by conditions in which genuine, honest expression of disagreement, uncertainty, or dissent is significantly socially and professionally costly. In these environments, which Edmondson's research found to be the norm rather than the exception, employees learn through experience that their professional survival and advancement depends significantly on managing upward impressions, conforming to organizational norms, and expressing agreement with authority even when private belief diverges. The social environment completes the training. Research on social conformity, in-group pressure, and the psychological costs of being the deviant voice in a group extends the Asch findings into virtually every social context studied. Work by Rod Kramer at Stanford on paranoid cognition in organizations found that most people carry a persistent, ambient awareness of how they are being evaluated by others, a constant background social monitoring that consumes cognitive resources and produces ongoing behavioral calibration to perceive social expectations. By the time most people reach adulthood, they have been through 15 to 20 years of a developmental environment that consistently rewards external orientation, looking outward for the measure of whether you are doing well, thinking correctly, being acceptable, and consistently penalizes internal orientation, looking inward for your own honest assessment, acting from your own values regardless of external reaction, maintaining your genuine position when it diverges from the group. The result is not stupidity or weakness, it is the entirely rational adaptation to an environment that has been consistently and clearly teaching a specific lesson. Your value is externally determined, your safety depends on approval, and deviation from the approved forms is genuinely costly. Being ungovernable in this context is not a natural resting state that you simply need to uncover. It is a developed capacity that requires deliberate cultivation against the grain of most of what your developmental environment has been teaching. And the cultivation begins with a specific quality of self-examination that most people never conduct. The most fundamental practice of psychological ungovernability is also the simplest to describe and the most difficult to execute. It is this: learning to distinguish in your actual moment-to-moment experience between what you genuinely think and what you have adopted as a way of managing your social environment. This distinction sounds straightforward. Most people asked whether they know what they think would say yes immediately and with confidence. But the research tells a more complicated story. Research by Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia on the limits of introspective access, his book Strangers to Ourselves is the most accessible synthesis, established that most people have significantly less direct access to the processes that determine their thoughts, feelings, and behavior than they intuitively believe. The reasons for our opinions, the sources of our preferences, the mechanisms that generate our emotional responses, these are, to a substantial degree, opaque to conscious introspection. We have access to the outputs of our cognitive processes, but not to the processes themselves. And the explanations we generate when asked to account for our beliefs and choices are largely post hoc constructions that feel like direct introspective reports, but are actually interpretive stories we tell about ourselves. This has a specific implication for the Ungovernable project. If you cannot reliably introspect on why you believe what you believe, you cannot assume that your current beliefs represent your genuine internal state, rather than the internalized product of social influence. The opinion you hold on any given topic, political, cultural, interpersonal, about yourself, may be genuinely yours. Or it may be the opinion that your social environment has made it most comfortable to hold. And the two can be phenomenologically indistinguishable without deliberate examination. The specific technique the research suggests for developing better access to genuine internal states is what psychologist Eric Klinger at the University of Minnesota studied as inner experience sampling, the deliberate. Systematic practice of pausing in the course of daily experience and inquiring into what is actually present in awareness, not what you think you should be thinking or feeling, what you are actually thinking or feeling right now when you examine it honestly. This practice sounds simple. Its effects, practiced consistently over time, are significant. Research on mindfulness, which is, at its core, a systematic training in this kind of present-moment self-awareness, has documented measurable changes in the way practitioners relate to their own thoughts, with reduced automatic identification with thoughts as the truth and increased capacity for the kind of observational distance from which genuine self-examination becomes possible. But the internal audit is not only about distinguishing genuine thoughts from socially adopted ones. It is also about distinguishing genuine values from the values you have been trained to endorse. And this distinction requires a specific and more demanding form of honest examination. Here is a practical exercise that the research on values and authentic living has converged on as one of the most reliably useful and most reliably uncomfortable exercises in self-knowledge. The exercise comes from work by Kelly Wilson at the University of Mississippi on acceptance and commitment therapy's values component, and from research by Brian Little on personal projects and personal strivings. It is simple in structure and genuinely revealing in application. Ask yourself, in the last week, in the specific situations where you chose a path of least social resistance, where you stayed quiet rather than expressing genuine disagreement, where you performed enthusiasm you did not feel, where you conformed to a norm that privately struck you as wrong or pointless, what value would you have been expressing if you had done the thing that actually reflected your internal state? What would it have meant about what you care about if you had said the true thing rather than the comfortable thing? The answer to this question, examined honestly across multiple instances, is one of the most reliable routes to the genuine values that the social compliance training has been covering. Not the values you endorse in the abstract, the values that show up as the untaken path, the thing you did not do or say because the social cost was too high. Research by Bill Mealer and Stephen Rolnick on motivational interviewing found that values clarification, the specific work of identifying and articulating what a person genuinely cares about, separate from what they are supposed to care about, is one of the most powerful facilitators of behavioral change in clinical settings. Not because it motivates through guilt or obligation, because it provides a genuine internal reference point from which decisions can be made that are genuinely the person's own. And decisions made from a genuine internal reference point have a completely different motivational architecture than decisions made from external pressure. The practical version of values excavation does not require a therapist or a formal protocol. It requires the specific habit of asking, in the moments when you notice yourself complying, conforming, or performing, what would I do here if I were not afraid of the social consequence? And then asking, what does the answer to that question tell me about what I actually care about? This is uncomfortable. The answers are sometimes things you would rather not know about yourself, things that contradict the values you publicly endorse, preferences that would surprise the people who think they know you, opinions that diverge significantly from your social group's consensus. The discomfort is the signal that you are finding something real, and it is worth sitting with that discomfort rather than immediately resolving it with the more comfortable answer, because the genuine values once found are the raw material of genuine ungovernability. They are what you stand on when external pressure pushes. They are the difference between the person who changes their position because new evidence genuinely convinced them and the person who changes their position because the social weather shifted. And the research on what that difference produces across a life is significant enough to be worth examining directly. Let's be honest about what sustained governability costs. Not in the abstract, in the specific, measurable, documented ways that the research has tracked across human lives. Research by Ken and Sheldon at the University of Missouri and colleagues on self-concordance, the degree to which a person's goals and pursuits genuinely arise from their own values and interests rather than external pressure or social obligation, found that self-concordant goal pursuit is associated with greater effort, greater enjoyment, better outcomes, and, most significantly, greater subjective well-being and life satisfaction over time. Non-self-concordant goal pursuit produces effort and sometimes produces outcomes, but it does not produce the kind of psychological nourishment that self-concordant pursuit does. And sustained non-self-concordant living, a life organized primarily around goals that are not genuinely one's own, is associated with a specific cluster of symptoms that clinical psychology describes as meaninglessness, alienation, and what Deci and Ryan call psychological ill-being. Research by Gemma Calvert and colleagues on the neurological correlates of authentic versus inauthentic behavior found that engaging in behavior that is inconsistent with one's genuine values activates brain regions associated with cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable state of holding simultaneously a self-concept that includes honesty, integrity, or authenticity and a behavior that contradicts it. This dissonance is not merely unpleasant. It is metabolically costly, reduces cognitive performance, and when sustained over time, is associated with the kinds of chronic stress responses that have measurable physiological consequences. Research by Brené Brown at the University of Houston on shame and vulnerability found that the sustained performance of a self that differs significantly from the genuine self, the sustained mask wearing that governability often requires, is one of the primary sources of what Brown calls chronic disconnection. The experience of being surrounded by people who know and respond to the performance but not the person. And chronic disconnection, Brown's research established, is not merely uncomfortable. It is one of the most reliable predictors of depression, anxiety, substance use, and the specific quality of suffering that comes from inhabiting a life that feels unfamiliar, as if it belongs to someone else. The person who has been successfully governed, whose behavior and expressed opinions are primarily organized around external approval, social safety, and conformity to institutional and social authority, has paid for that safety with something specific. They have paid with the ongoing experience of their own life as something that is happening to them rather than something they are creating. They have paid with the specific variety of alienation that comes from looking at your own choices and recognizing that many of them were not made from anywhere inside you. And they have paid, over time, with the particular quiet desperation of a person who is, by every external measure, fine, and who knows in a way they can barely articulate that fine is not the same as alive. This is what the research on autonomy and authentic living has been consistently documenting for 4 decades. And it is the research that makes the project of genuine ungovernability not a political statement or an adolescent rebellion, but a straightforward, documented requirement for psychological health. And that brings us to the most important and most practically significant section of this entire conversation, the moment where the research and the practice converge on the specific tools that actually develop genuine ungovernability. Here is where we arrive at the center of everything this conversation has been building toward, and I want to say it with precision. Because the precision matters. Genuine ungovernability is not a state you achieve once and maintain forever. It is not a personality type you either have or lack. It is a practice. A set of specific cognitive, emotional, and behavioral habits that, maintained consistently over time, produce a genuinely different relationship between your internal state and external pressure. A relationship in which external pressure is fully registered, felt, noticed, understood, but has progressively less capacity to determine your choices. The research has converged on 4 specific practices that develop this capacity. They are drawn from self-determination theory, acceptance and commitment therapy, research on value-based living, and the neuroscience of self-regulation. They are not advanced or esoteric. They are, in some ways, extremely ordinary. But their ordinariness is deceptive, because practiced consistently, they produce changes in the psychological structure that governs behavior that are genuine and lasting. The first practice is deliberate opinion forming. Before expressing an opinion in a social context, particularly a social context where expressing a specific opinion is clearly the low-friction option, pause and form the opinion internally first. This is not about contrarianism. It is about the specific cognitive habit of consulting your own genuine assessment of a situation before checking the social weather and adjusting to it. Ask yourself, if I were alone and the social consequence of what I think was 0, what would I actually think about this? Form that opinion. Then, with full awareness of what your genuine position is, decide what to express in the social context. This practice sounds trivial. Its effects are not. Research on deliberate opinion formation by Jonathan Levave at Columbia Business School and colleagues found that people who form opinions privately before encountering social pressure show significantly greater independence of judgment from group consensus than people who form opinions in the presence of social pressure. The opinion that is formed before the social weather is consulted is considerably harder to displace by social pressure than the opinion that is formed in the midst of it. Over time, the habit of consulting your own genuine assessment before the social weather does something to the internal architecture. It strengthens the internal reference system. It makes your own judgment a more salient and more trusted input into your decisions. And this, over time, is what shifts the balance between internal and external governance. The second practice is deliberate discomfort exposure, specifically social discomfort. This is the most demanding of the 4 practices and the most directly relevant to developing genuine distress tolerance. Research on exposure-based approaches to anxiety, the documented finding that repeated, graduated exposure to feared situations reduces the threat response associated with them, applies directly to social discomfort. The specific discomfort that the governability system runs on is the anxiety of disapproval, the threat of social rejection, the discomfort of being the dissenting voice, and the most reliable way to reduce the power of that anxiety is the same as the most reliable way to reduce any anxiety. Repeated, deliberate, graduated exposure. In practice, identify small, low-stakes social situations in which you can express a genuine opinion, maintain a genuine position, or choose a behavior that reflects your actual values rather than social expectations at a modest social cost. A disagreement with someone whose approval you value, handled with care and honesty rather than capitulation. A stated preference that differs from what the group is gravitating toward. A question that challenges a consensus position, asked genuinely rather than to provoke. These small exposures, done repeatedly in contexts where the actual cost is manageable, build the distress tolerance that larger acts of genuine ungovernability require. The nervous system learns, through accumulated evidence, that social disapproval is uncomfortable and not dangerous. And as that learning accumulates, the anxious compliance that governability depends on loses its grip. The third practice is values-grounded decision-making. This is the practice of explicitly connecting daily decisions, particularly the ones that involve social pressure, to your identified genuine values and using the values as the active decision criterion rather than social expectation. Research by Kelly Wilson and Tobias Lundgren on the practical application of acceptance and commitment therapy's values component found that the consistent practice of values-grounded decision-making, of explicitly asking, before a significant choice, what decision here would reflect what I actually care about, produces measurable increases in authentic living scores and measurable decreases in experiential avoidance over time. The values become more salient as decision inputs, the external pressure becomes relatively less salient, and the decisions made feel progressively more like your own. The practical version is simply the habit of asking the question before consequential choices. Which option here reflects what I actually value, as opposed to what it would be most comfortable to choose? The question does not guarantee that you always choose the value-consistent option. Sometimes the cost is genuinely too high. Sometimes other considerations legitimately outweigh the value, and wisdom includes knowing the difference. But the habit of asking means that the genuine values are present in the decision rather than absent, and that whatever you choose is chosen with full awareness of what it does and does not reflect. The fourth practice is building genuine psychological safety in close relationships. This one is different from the first three because it is relational rather than individual, but the research on it is direct and important. Research by James Cone on social baseline theory and by attachment researchers on earned security established that the nervous system's threat response, the thing that makes social disapproval feel dangerous rather than merely uncomfortable, is significantly regulated by the quality of close relationships. People who have at least one relationship in which they can express genuine thoughts, genuine disagreements, and genuine values without experiencing disapproval as a threat to the relationship show significantly higher psychological autonomy and significantly lower susceptibility to social influence in their broader social environments. The relationship in which you can be genuinely yourself, in which you have tested the hypothesis that your genuine self is acceptable, rather than merely your performed self, is not just personally nourishing. It is neurologically regulating. It provides the experienced evidence that genuine expression is survivable, that disagreement is survivable, that the loss of approval in one context does not mean the loss of belonging in all contexts. And that evidence, accumulated through a genuinely safe, close relationship, recalibrates the threat system's sensitivity to social disapproval everywhere. Building genuine psychological safety in close relationships is therefore not separate from the project of becoming ungovernable. It is one of its most important foundations. The person who has at least one relationship in which genuine self-expression is consistently safe has a neurological and experiential resource that makes genuine ungovernability in other contexts progressively more accessible. These four practices, maintained consistently over time, produce a genuine change in the psychological architecture, not a change that makes you indifferent to others or above social consequence, or freed from the reality that belonging and approval are genuinely important human needs. A change that shifts the balance, gradually, durably, measurably, between being governed by external reference and being governed by internal reference. And the outcome of that shift, the life that is progressively more organized around genuine values, genuine self-knowledge, and the specific courage of being genuinely yourself in context where it is costly, is documented in the research with enough consistency to take seriously. Let's ground the practices in the neuroscience, because understanding what is actually happening neurologically when you develop these capacities changes how you understand the project. The brain structures most relevant to the Ungovernable project are the prefrontal cortex, the anterior insula, the default mode network, and the amygdala, and their interactions. The prefrontal cortex, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, is involved in value-based decision-making, self-referential processing, and the regulation of social behavior. Research by Antonio Damasio at the University of Iowa on patients with prefrontal damage established that damage to specific prefrontal regions produces what Damasio called acquired sociopathy, the inability to make adaptive decisions in social contexts, not because of impaired reasoning, but because of impaired access to the somatic markers, the body-based emotional signals, that ordinarily inform value-based choices. People with intact prefrontal function use these emotional signals as one of the key inputs into decisions about what matters and what to choose. Strengthening the prefrontal-based system of value representation is literally the neuroscience of developing genuine values clarity. The anterior insula is involved in interoception, the perception of internal bodily states, including the felt sense of discomfort when behavior is inconsistent with values. Research by Hugo Critchley at the University of Sussex found that people with higher interoceptive awareness, better access to the body's internal signals, show greater emotional intelligence, better decision-making, and greater self-knowledge. The practice of attending to the body's responses, the specific felt sense of discomfort when you are performing rather than expressing, the quality of ease or tension that accompanies different choices, is the practice of developing the interoceptive access that the Ungovernable project requires. The default mode network, the brain's self-referential processing network, active during rest and mind wandering, is where the narrative self is constructed. Research by Michael Gazzaniga at the University of California, Santa Barbara on the interpretive function of the brain's left hemisphere established that the brain is continuously constructing a coherent narrative of the self, its motivations, and its choices. The quality of that narrative, whether it is primarily an authentic account of genuine values and genuine choices, or primarily a post hoc rationalization of socially compliant behavior, is both a cause and a consequence of the degree to which a person has developed genuine self-authorship. The amygdala, as we have discussed, is the threat detection center that makes social disapproval feel dangerous. Research on amygdala reactivity and emotion regulation by James Gross at Stanford established that the amygdala's response to social and emotional threats is significantly modulated by top-down regulatory input from the prefrontal cortex. The person who has developed strong prefrontal regulation of emotional response through the accumulated practice of tolerating discomfort, maintaining values-consistent behavior under social pressure, and building the experiential evidence that disapproval is manageable, shows measurably lower amygdala reactivity to social threat. The neuroscience of ungovernability is the neuroscience of a brain in which the prefrontal value systems are strong and well connected, the interoceptive access to internal states is clear, the self-narrative is genuinely anchored in values rather than social performance, and the amygdala's threat response to social disapproval is regulated by accumulated experiential evidence that the cost of genuine expression is survivable. This is not a brain that is less social or less caring about others. It is a brain that has developed the specific capacities that make genuine choice possible, rather than the reflexive, anxiety-driven compliance that passes for choice in the governable mind. One of the most important clarifications in this entire conversation is the one that prevents the ungovernable project from becoming a justification for sociopathy. Genuine ungovernability, the autonomy-based, value-grounded, internally referenced psychological state we have been describing, is not a social. It is not the state in which other people do not matter, in which social consequences are ignored, or in which the needs and feelings of others are below consideration. That state is not ungovernability. It is the kind of defensive self-enclosure that produces a different and equally problematic form of captivity. The captivity of a self so defended against external influence that genuine connection and genuine growth both become impossible. Research by Deci and Ryan on the relationship between autonomy and relatedness in self-determination theory is explicit on this point. The three fundamental needs, competence, autonomy, and relatedness, are not in tension. They support each other. The person who has genuine autonomy, who acts from genuine values rather than from social pressure, is on average more capable of genuine relatedness, not less. Because genuine relatedness requires the genuine self to be present in the relationship, and the social performance required by governability systematically removes the genuine self from the relational encounter. Research by Aaron and colleagues on self-disclosure and intimacy found that the depth of connection available in a relationship is directly related to the degree of genuine self-expression that occurs within it. The person who is performing rather than expressing, who is presenting the version of themselves that manages social approval rather than the person who actually exists, is not available for genuine connection. They are available only for connection with the performance. And connection with the performance, however skillfully maintained, is not the same as connection with the person. The ungovernable person, the person who has developed genuine values, clarity, genuine distress tolerance, and genuine identity stability, is paradoxically more available for genuine relationship than the governable person, because they are actually present. The version of themselves that shows up in relationships is the actual version. And the genuine version, with its real opinions and real values and real responses to experience, is what genuine relationship is made of. The goal of the Ungovernable project is not isolation. It is the specific quality of social engagement that is only possible when you are genuinely present, when the person in the relationship is the actual person, rather than the socially managed performance of a person. This distinction between genuine social engagement from a position of autonomy and the performance of social engagement from a position of compliance is one of the most important things the research on authentic living has established, and it has direct implications for how you understand not only your relationship with yourself, but your relationship with everyone around you. Before we close, I want to be direct about something that the research-focused framing of this conversation can inadvertently soften. Genuine ungovernability requires courage, not the dramatic courage of grand gestures or public opposition, the quieter, more demanding, and more sustained courage of continuing to be genuinely yourself in contexts that are consistently pressuring you not to be. Research by Cynthia Puri at Clemson University on the psychology of courage identified what she calls general personal courage, the ordinary, everyday courage of acting in accordance with one's genuine values in the face of significant anticipated costs. Puri's research found that this form of courage is not a personality trait that some people have and others lack. It is a behavior, a specific choice that is made or not made in specific situations. And like any behavior, it is susceptible to development through practice. The courage that ungovernability requires shows up in specific moments that are easy to recognize and difficult to act in. The moment in a meeting when you see a decision being made that you believe is wrong, and everyone else in the room appears comfortable with it, and the cost of saying so is social friction with people whose approval you value. The moment in a conversation when someone says something you genuinely disagree with, and the path of least resistance is agreement or silence, and the cost of honest engagement is the temporary disruption of the social warmth. The moment when you notice that the position you are publicly holding is not quite the position you actually hold, and the cost of saying so is the social awkwardness of apparent inconsistency. These moments, small, ordinary, daily, are the training ground of genuine ungovernability. Not because grand acts of public opposition are irrelevant, but because the capacity for grand acts of genuine ungovernability is built from thousands of small acts of genuine expression in contexts where the easier choice was performance. Research by Roy Baumeister at Florida State University on willpower and self-regulation found that self-regulatory capacity, the capacity to choose the harder right option over the easier comfortable one, is both finite in the short term and expandable through practice over time. The person who has developed the habit of small-scale genuine expression in socially costly moments has built a specific regulatory capacity that makes larger acts of genuine ungovernability more accessible. The practice compounds, and the thing that the practice produces, over weeks, months, years of choosing genuine expression over social performance, genuine values over external expectation, internal reference over the social weather, is a specific quality of relationship with your own life that is difficult to describe and unmistakable when it is present. It is the quality of being genuinely the author of what you are doing, of looking at your choices, not all of them, not perfectly but with some consistency, and recognizing them as yours, as arising from somewhere inside you rather than being produced by the pressure of everything outside you. It is, in the most ordinary and most profound sense, the experience of being free. The research on what genuine psychological autonomy produces across a life is worth examining in its full scope, because the stakes of the Ungovernable project are not small, and the research takes them seriously. Longitudinal research by Christopher Peterson and Martin Seligman on character strengths and virtues, one of the most extensive cross-cultural studies of what makes human lives go well, identified authenticity and integrity as among the most consistently predictive character strengths for life satisfaction, relationship quality, and what Seligman calls flourishing, not the most dramatic or the most immediately impressive strengths. Among the most reliably associated with the specific quality of well-being that sustains across decades and across changing circumstances. Research by Laura Costenson at Stanford's Center on Longevity on Emotional Development across the lifespan found something that directly relevant to the Ungovernable project and its relationship to time. As people age and develop what Costenson calls a time-limited perspective, an increasingly conscious awareness of the finitude of their time, they show a consistent shift in motivational priorities, away from the approval-seeking, status-oriented, and socially conforming behaviors that dominate earlier life, and toward more genuine self-expression, more value-consistent behavior, and more honest engagement with what actually matters to them. Carstensen found that older adults consistently report higher emotional well-being, lower anxiety, and more positive affect than younger adults. A finding that contradicts the cultural assumption that aging is primarily a story of decline, and the mechanism she identified is directly relevant. The experience of finite time reduces the motivational power of the approval system. When time feels limited, the costs of spending it in performance rather than genuine expression become visible in a way they are not when time feels unlimited. Older adults become on average more ungovernable, not through some mystical transformation, but through the natural consequence of caring less about infinite future approval and more about the genuine quality of finite present experience. The insight this offers is both simple and important. You do not have to wait for time limitation to motivate genuine expression. The research suggests you can access that perspective deliberately. Through the temporal distancing practice we discussed, through the deliberate practice of asking, what would I choose if my time were genuinely finite and I wanted to spend it in genuine expression? And use it to motivate the Ungovernable project now, rather than arriving at it by default much later. And the people who have developed genuine ungovernability, through deliberate practice, through accumulated courage, through the specific development of the three pillars of values clarity, distress tolerance, and identity stability, show up in the research as the people who are most genuinely available for the things that the research consistently identifies as the sources of a life well lived: genuine connection, meaningful work, the honest engagement with reality that makes genuine understanding possible, and the specific quality of freedom that comes from looking at your own life and recognizing it as genuinely yours. That is what being ungovernable is for. Not opposition, not isolation, not the performance of rebellion for an audience that has simply replaced the previous performance. The quiet, durable, genuinely radical state of being the actual author of your own experience. Here is what I want to leave you with. The next time you notice yourself about to comply, about to say the comfortable thing rather than the honest thing, choose the socially safe option rather than the value-consistent one, go along with the consensus that your genuine internal state is quietly disagreeing with. Pause for one moment before you act, just one moment. In that moment, ask yourself two questions. First, what would I actually choose here if the social cost were zero? Form that genuine option. Hold it in your awareness clearly. Second, given what I know about what actually matters to me, what do I want to choose here? You do not need to always choose the value-consistent option. Sometimes the cost is genuinely too high. Sometimes other considerations legitimately outweigh the value. Genuine ungovernability is not about always choosing the harder thing. It is about choosing with full awareness of what you are actually choosing, and why, and what it does and does not reflect about who you genuinely are. The practice of that awareness, the habit of actually checking in with your own genuine state before defaulting to performance, is the foundation of everything we have discussed. It is where the Ungovernable project begins. Not in dramatic acts of public defiance, but in the small, daily, accumulating practice of being honestly present in your own experience. If this kind of conversation, specific, research-grounded, and honest about what genuine psychological freedom actually requires, is what you are looking for, this channel is built exactly for that. Each video is the same commitment, the real science of how human beings work, and what it takes to live as one who is genuinely free. See you in the next one.